Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. A place cemented in history for the heroism and sacrifice the men that landed there endured. But there was one group of people who were not just present on Omaha, but all of the landing beaches, and their efforts saved countless lives, a figure we will never be able to put a number on, but they would pay a high price in the process. One of these men reported that they were being systematically targeted by the beach's defenders once they realized how important they were. They were the engineers tasked with clearing the obstacles and mines before, during, and after the first wave of men hit the beaches. Rommel was a brilliant tactician, and he understood that any attack had to be stopped on the beaches, because if they were to make their way inland, the battle was lost. After he was assigned to Army Group B to strengthen the Atlantic Wall along the Channel coast in November 1943, he designated the beaches as an MLR, or main line of resistance. He instructed the garrisons along the Atlantic Wall to strengthen not only the defences in terms of manpower, bunkers, and machine gun nests, but minefields, obstacles, etc. There was actually a methodical plan the Germans had devised for creating minefields. Not only were they excellent at recording every mine that had been laid and where, but at creating an impossible web that made sure eventually you would step on one of the many mines they had at their disposal. The Germans did leave corridors for the passage of their own men, but even these were teed off at a known location if the Allies happened to find one of them. Veterans even reported faux minefields that they would still avoid for obvious reasons. On and around the beaches this was no different, but they also placed much larger mines designed to destroy any landing craft attempting to ferry men and material ashore. Sometimes they were simply attached to the end of a piece of timber buried at an angle in the sand. Sometimes a small concrete structure was placed to direct the blast upwards. They also placed other obstacles, Belgian gates, hedgehogs. The list goes on. The majority of these obstacles were placed when the tide was at its lowest, so they were as concealed as possible when the tide came in. This meant that the men whose job it was to either disable them or simply blow them up would often find themselves below water, with the landing craft passing directly above their heads, sometimes working as far down as 15 feet below the surface. The British units were known as the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units, or LOCUs for short. They would be supported by Royal Engineers, whose job it was to clear obstacles inland. They were both under the command of the specialised 79th Armoured Division that was created specifically for D-Day. Landing craft designed to get men ashore in relative safety would be of no use, as their jobs started before the beach did, so many would instead make their journey in inflatable boats that offered no protection whatsoever, and unlike the infantry, who could hide in craters or behind things such as anti-tank walls, they were completely exposed. The American units were known as Naval Combat Demolition Units. They had arrived in England in late 1943 onwards after undergoing training at Fort Pierce in Florida. This training included the now famous Hell Week. By D-Day, a little over 30 teams had been assembled in England. Each team consisted of one officer and 5 enlisted men, as this was the capacity of the rubber boat they would make their final approach in. They would be supplemented by a further 27 engineers and 3 sailors. Together, they were known as Gap Assault Teams, and on Omaha Beach, 16 teams were to clear 16 50-yard wide safe corridors. Unlike their Royal Navy counterparts, the Americans had a different idea. The NCDUs were in fact dressed much the same as the infantry, usually lacking underwater breathing equipment. They were instead to clear obstacles at the waterline forward, starting 3 minutes after the first wave had landed. This inability to swim, never mind submerge, resulted in only parts of the obstacles being cleared. Only 5 of the 16 planned corridors were open on D-Day, and it wasn't until D+2 that this was completed. One team, known as Vetter's Vandals, never made it ashore after a shell struck their boat laden with 300 pounds of explosives, and the teams that did make it had to deal with not only the carnage unfolding around them, with men using the very obstacles they were sent to destroy as cover, but also the rapidly rising tide. The job to clear the beaches went far beyond D-Day. Even with the German plans to hand, the ones that weren't destroyed, ordnance still shows up from time to time. There were thousands of mines placed in and around each of the beaches, and it's quite surprising anyone made it off at all, but a lot of the thanks has to go to those specialist engineers who carried out their work. Their casualty rates were some of the highest to land on June 6th, at around 70%.